Let's drift back. Not just a few hundred years, or even a few thousand. Let's go back to a time when vast glaciers covered much of the earth, and survival meant carving shelter from frozen landscapes, hunting giants with sharpened stone, and learning how to make fire, not just to cook, but to live. Before we begin, I'd love to know, maybe you're lying in bed with the lights low, or maybe you're out for a quiet walk under the stars. Wherever you are and whatever time it is, so drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what the time is as you listen to this. It's become a favorite part of the channel, seeing people all around the world finding peace in these stories. And if you haven't already, feel free to subscribe so we can spend more evenings like this together. Roughly 20,000 years ago, the Earth was in the grip of the last glacial maximum. It was the coldest point of the last ice age, and for early humans, including both Homo sapiens and the last surviving groups of Neanderthals, it was a time of extraordinary challenge. Temperatures in Europe were up to 10 degrees colder than today. In much of northern Eurasia and North America, sheets of ice over a mile thick buried the land. Yet somehow, despite the freezing winds, the lack of agriculture, and the absence of modern technology, our ancestors not only endured, they adapted. They found ways to live, love, and even thrive. And the secrets to that survival weren't just brute strength or luck. They were knowledge, cooperation, innovation, and a deep intuitive understanding of the world around them. The story of how cavemen survived isn't just a tale of hardship, it's a tale of genius. One of the most underestimated aspects of Ice Age survival is clothing. We often imagine cavemen in ragged hides, barely keeping warm, but archaeological evidence tells a different story. From the discovery of finely worked bone needles, dating back nearly 40,000 years, we know that early humans were sewing. They stitched together layers of reindeer, mammoth, and fox pelts to make insulating garments, likely including tailored trousers, boots, and hooded cloaks. These weren't crude wrappings, they were functional outfits, sometimes even adorned with beads or decorative stitching. And there's more. The Inuits, who developed cold climate adaptations thousands of years later, used similar methods, layering fur with the hair facing inwards for insulation and outwards for weatherproofing. It's not unlikely that Upper Paleolithic humans did the same. These people weren't primitive brutes. They understood warmth, windproofing, and mobility because their lives depended on it. Shelter was another key to survival. Natural caves offered refuge, and many were used extensively, especially across southern France and northern Spain. But not every group had access to caves, especially as populations spread into the open steppe and tundra. So they built. They used mammoth bones, huge rib cages and curved tusks to form frameworks for huts, covering them with hides and insulating them with earth, moss, or snow. At a site in Mizhyrich, Ukraine, archaeologists found the remains of a circular dwelling made from over 100 mammoth bones. It had a central hearth, and evidence suggests it may have been used over multiple seasons. Imagine that for a moment. A family huddled around a fire, snow falling silently outside, protected by the remains of the very animals they had hunted to live. Fire wasn't just warmth, it was life. Fire hardened spear tips, cooked meat, scared off predators, and gave people a place to gather and pass down stories. And perhaps that's not too different from what we're doing here tonight. Then there was food, the great pursuit of every waking hour. In these frozen landscapes, people couldn't rely on farming or stored crops. They had to move with the herds, and the herds were massive. Reindeer, bison, aurochs, woolly mammoths, and even the formidable woolly rhinoceros roamed the icy plains. These weren't solitary hunters. They coordinated in small bands, often family-based, tracking animals for days before closing in with spears tipped with flint or obsidian. And there's evidence of even more advanced methods, driving herds into natural traps, coordinating ambushes, and possibly even using early forms of communication, hand signals, whistles, and maybe even rudimentary languages. In places like the Dordogne region in France, caches of hunting tools and remains show seasonal hunting camps, suggesting people return to the same locations year after year, following migratory routes that had been known for generations. Yet what's most remarkable, perhaps, is how they thought. These early humans weren't merely surviving, they were imagining, creating, expressing. In the depths of Ice Age caves, where light barely reaches, they painted horses, mammoths, deer, and enigmatic symbols dance across stone walls. The Chauvet cave paintings in France date back around 36,000 years, older than the pyramids by tens of thousands of years, and they show an incredible understanding of motion, anatomy, even shadow. Some scholars believe these paintings had ritual purposes, or were part of initiation ceremonies, or storytelling traditions. Others think they were part of early spiritual beliefs, maybe even the first glimpses of religion. What matters is that the people who painted them weren't just trying to survive a cold world. They were reaching beyond it, imagining other worlds. And maybe, when we look at those ancient images, we see not strangers, but the first artists in our human family. So when we ask how cavemen survived the last ice age, we shouldn't think of them as desperate figures clawing their way through blizzards. We should picture them as adaptable, intelligent, and deeply social beings. They understood their environment, not through books or science, but through generations of observation. They learned which plants to avoid, how to follow animal tracks over frozen ground, how to store fat-rich marrow inside hollow bones for leaner times, and how to come together when the cold was at its worst. And as we explore this story more deeply, part by part, I invite you to settle in, not just to hear about ancient history, but to reconnect with a part of yourself, because their story is our story. One of the most quietly powerful tools our ancestors possessed during the Ice Age wasn't a spear or a fire-hardened weapon. It was memory. Generational knowledge passed down through stories, through practice, and through the lived experiences of elders became the closest thing to a survival manual that existed. Picture a young child sitting beside an elder as they scrape clean a reindeer hide, being told about a winter when the snow came early and the mammoth herds moved south weeks ahead of schedule. Or a group of teenagers learning to carve stone tools by watching the practiced hands of someone who'd done it for decades. There were no written records, no drawings of strategy or migration routes, and yet somehow, communities knew when to move, where to hunt, how to find edible roots hidden beneath the frost. This kind of knowledge, passed mouth to mouth and hand to hand, is part of what gave Homo sapiens an edge over their close cousins, the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals, who shared the Ice Age landscape with modern humans for thousands of years, were astonishingly capable in their own right, stockier and more robust than Homo sapiens. With larger brow ridges and powerful musculature, they were perfectly built for cold climates. They had brains just as large as, sometimes larger than ours, and they too used tools, fire, and lived in complex social groups. But something subtle, and not fully understood, shifted the balance. While Neanderthals hunted effectively and used natural caves as shelter, Homo sapiens developed greater flexibility. They built more varied tools, using bone and antler, which allowed for finer work like needles, fishhooks, and even barbed points. They also seemed to form larger social networks. Archaeological evidence suggests that Homo sapiens groups maintained broader alliances, exchanging materials, ornaments, and knowledge across long distances. This meant that in times of hardship, one group could rely on another, a kind of ancient mutual aid system that made survival more resilient. Another crucial difference was diet. Homo sapiens consumed a wider range of foods. While Neanderthals appeared to rely heavily on large game, modern humans gathered berries, nuts, roots, and even fish where they could. In a world of uncertainty, dietary flexibility meant everything. Imagine the difference between a group that can only eat what they hunt, and another that can scrape lichens off rocks, crack open pine cones for seeds, and know which insects are safe to eat. That kind of dietary diversity wasn't just a bonus, it was often the margin between life and death, and it wasn't random. It came from careful observation, shared learning, and a willingness to experiment with the environment. In some sites, charred remains of plant seeds have been found alongside stone tools, hinting at a more complex approach to gathering than we once assumed. Some researchers even believe that early humans used primitive cooking techniques to detoxify certain roots in plants that would otherwise be dangerous. And then there was the matter of migration, a slow, pulsing rhythm of movement that matched the beat of the planet itself. During the coldest phases, people moved southward toward warmer refuges like the Iberian Peninsula, the Balkans, and parts of the Levant. These weren't mass migrations like armies marching, but slow generational shifts. A group might move only a few dozen miles in a decade, following herds or retreating from advancing ice, and when the climate warmed even slightly, they would push back north, reclaiming territory that had been lost to snow and wind. This slow dance with the climate required remarkable intuition. It's easy to forget that our ancestors lived in complete exposure to the seasons, without weather forecasts, without written maps, without even fixed homes, and yet they navigated valleys, rivers, and open plains with astonishing precision, knowing where to find fresh water, which stones made the best tools, and which passes would be blocked by snow each year. Social bonds were the invisible thread that held it all together. In small groups of perhaps 25 to 40 people, everyone had a role. Children helped with gathering and crafting. Elders, though slower, were repositories of memory. Hunters were skilled and often highly trained from youth, while others may have specialized in tool-making, fire-tending, or foraging. These weren't just nuclear families. They were extended kin groups, bound by necessity, but also by affection. Some burial sites show signs of care for the sick or injured, evidence that early humans didn't just abandon those who couldn't contribute. One burial in Shanidar Cave, for instance, shows a man who lived many years with a withered arm and a damaged eye socket, someone who would have needed help every day, and yet was cared for and buried with ceremony. That's not just survival, that's community. Art continued to play a deeper role than we might first think. Not only were there painted caves, but also carved figurines, like the Venus figurines found across Europe, depicting female forms with exaggerated features. These weren't just sculptures. They were carried, treasured, and possibly worshipped. They may have been fertility symbols, cultural emblems, or objects of ritual. Some were made of ivory, others of stone or bone, and many were found far from the materials they were made from, suggesting trade or long-distance movement. Even more curious are the patterns found etched into bone or antler, cross-hatchings, repeating lines or dots, which some researchers believe could be early forms of counting or calendrical tracking. When you realize that humans living 20,000 or even 30,000 years ago may have been tracking the phases of the moon or mapping the seasons through marks on a bone, it shifts the whole idea of what prehistoric really means. The cold didn't just shape what early humans wore or where they lived. It shaped how they thought. In an unforgiving world where a sudden storm could mean death, planning ahead wasn't a luxury, it was a survival trait. Archaeological sites from the Upper Paleolithic period show signs of long-term thinking. In some caves and rock shelters, piles of stored firewood have been found, suggesting deliberate stockpiling. In others, caches of tools and animal bones hint at preparations for future visits. This kind of foresight points to something deeper than instinct. It speaks to imagination, to abstract thought, to the idea of tomorrow. For us, that might sound simple, but for a species that had only recently developed language and symbolism, this ability to mentally step into the future was nothing short of revolutionary. It meant that early humans could coordinate hunts not just in the moment, but days in advance. They could anticipate food scarcity and ration supplies. They could plan seasonal movements, even remember where they had hidden supplies months earlier. Language, though invisible in the archaeological record, likely played a central role in this transformation. While no one can say with certainty when fully structured language developed, most researchers agree that by the height of the last ice age, Homo sapiens had complex speech. Think of what that allowed. Not just naming objects, but sharing experiences, warning of danger, describing places, telling stories. It enabled deeper cooperation. A group that could communicate fluently, could plan hunts with greater efficiency, teach skills more precisely, and reinforce social bonds through songs, jokes, and shared myths. Imagine sitting around a fire, the wind howling outside, and listening to someone describe a great hunt from years past, their voice echoing in the flickering firelight, passing down not just facts, but values, pride, and belonging. These weren't mute figures scraping by in silence. They were storytellers, teachers, and dreamers. It's likely that ritual and spirituality were deeply embedded in Ice Age life. Burial sites from the period reveal more than practical interment. They show ceremony. Some individuals were buried with red ochre, a pigment often associated with symbolic meaning. Others were laid to rest with tools, beads, or animal bones, as if sent off with the items they would need in another world. At the Sungir site in Russia, a man and 2 children were buried in rich garments adorned with thousands of ivory beads, many requiring hours of meticulous craftsmanship. These weren't utilitarian burials. They were expressions of grief, reverence, perhaps even belief in an afterlife. What did they think happened after death? We can't say, but the care they took with their dead speaks to a profound emotional life. They mourned, they remembered, they honored the ones they lost, much as we do today. The cold world they inhabited wasn't barren, it was alive, though in ways most of us would find alien. The great steppes of Ice Age Europe and Asia were covered not in ice, but in dry grasslands known as the Mammoth Steppe. It stretched from France to Siberia, one of the richest ecosystems in Earth's history. There were no forests, too little rain, but the grasses fed enormous herds, woolly mammoths, bison, horses, antelope, and reindeer. These herds in turn supported wolves, cave lions, hyenas, and of course humans. The steppe was both harsh and abundant, a land of contrasts. One day might bring a successful hunt and a roaring fire, the next, a blizzard and an empty stomach. To live here, you had to be ready for both, and our ancestors were. They studied animal movements, followed migration patterns, and read the landscape like a book. A single set of footprints, a patch of trampled grass, or a dung pile, could tell them more than any map ever could. Their tools, too, were evolving. While earlier humans relied on simple hand axes and flake tools, by the time of the last glacial maximum, Homo sapiens were crafting composite tools, weapons made from multiple materials. A spear might have a wooden shaft, a flint point, and bindings of sinew or rawhide. Some even had resin adhesives made from tree sap and charcoal, evidence of an almost chemical level of understanding. They weren't just finding what worked, they were experimenting, and their tools weren't only weapons. Scrapers for processing hides, burins for carving, awls for piercing holes in clothing. These were the technologies of survival, and like everything else, these tools were often shared, taught, and traded. In some sites, flint has been found hundreds of miles from where it was quarried, meaning people either traveled great distances or exchanged materials with others. Even in a fragmented Ice Age world, human networks stretched far and wide, but survival wasn't only about tools or knowledge, it was about resilience. To be born into an Ice Age world meant facing suffering. You might lose a sibling to disease, a parent in a hunting accident, a child to the cold. There were no guarantees, and yet, despite this, people danced, they sang, they carved figures, painted walls, and carried symbols with them. There is something deeply human in that, a refusal to be crushed by the world, no matter how brutal. In one cave in Spain, a handprint made over 30,000 years ago still marks the wall, surrounded by images of animals and abstract signs. We don't know who they were. We don't know their name, or the sound of their voice, or the thoughts that filled their days, but they left a mark. And in doing so, they reached across time to say, I was here, I lived. The challenges of Ice Age survival were not constant. They ebbed and flowed like the glaciers themselves. There were warmer periods, called interstadials, when the climate eased just slightly, and life had a chance to breathe again. Rivers would flow more freely, plant life would expand just enough to support more game, and groups could settle in one area for longer stretches. These were windows of opportunity. During these times, you find more signs of semi-permanent habitation: stone circles, hearths layered with ash from many fires, and garbage pits filled with bones and broken tools. But even during the milder spells, people could never fully relax. They always knew the cold would return. That mindset, one of constant preparedness, shaped their entire worldview. It wasn't anxiety, but a form of practical wisdom. They knew not to overhunt a region, not to overstay in one place, to keep a mental map of other campsites, other water sources, and escape routes. In their world, being prepared wasn't about survival kits, it was a way of life. One of the more mysterious aspects of this time is the role of symbolic thought in decision-making. In many Ice Age cultures, there's evidence that survival was closely tied to rituals, not just spiritual, but practical rituals, believed to influence the world. Some caves show repeated markings near images of prey animals, as though early humans were calling the hunt or asking for favor from unseen forces. In some regions, the same animals appear over and over: bison, horses, mammoths, not just as artistic subjects, but as recurring themes. These weren't random drawings, they were deliberate. Some were placed near acoustically resonant parts of caves, where the echo of voices or drums would create an eerie, immersive effect. It's possible that people believed sound itself had power, that by speaking, chanting, or singing in these places, they could connect with something larger. Perhaps they didn't separate the world into physical and spiritual the way we do. For them, a hunt, a story, a fire, a cave, all were part of the same breath. Physical health during the Ice Age was, unsurprisingly, a constant concern. Without modern medicine, infections from even small injuries could turn deadly. But early humans weren't helpless. There's growing evidence that they used natural remedies, plants with antiseptic properties, chewed willow bark, a natural form of salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin, and poultices made from moss and lichen. Wounds were likely cleaned with warm water, possibly even boiled with heated stones, and covered with animal fat to keep out bacteria. They also seem to understand rest and care. Skeletal remains show signs of healed fractures and long-term illnesses, which means people survived injuries thanks to the help of others. In a small band, caring for one sick member was a burden, but they still did it. That speaks to compassion, but also to the practical value of every individual. A good storyteller, a skilled hide worker, or an experienced elder wasn't easily replaced. These people mattered, not just for their labor, but for their wisdom. Childhood in the Ice Age, while short by our standards, was deeply significant. Children were not just passive members of the group. They were involved, watching, mimicking, absorbing. In some cave sites, tiny handprints suggest that children were allowed, even encouraged, to participate in ritual and art. Small tools and toy-like objects have been found in dwellings, indicating that kids practiced tool-making and other crafts from an early age. Their games likely mirrored adult life, pretending to hunt, to gather, to build, and through this, they learned the skills they would need to survive. But beyond function, there was care. Burial sites of young children are some of the most elaborate, suggesting profound grief and love. One site in Austria revealed a child buried with a fox-tooth necklace and a carved ivory figurine, items that took time to make, offered in mourning. These were not disposable lives. These were cherished children, part of a tightly woven social world that held even the smallest members close. As groups moved through the landscape, they often left subtle signs behind, not just of their presence, but of their culture. Carvings on cliff walls, scratches on antlers, even footprints preserved in now hardened mud. All echo the rhythm of people moving together. In one extraordinary site in France, dozens of footprints from adults, children, and possibly even babies were found deep within a cave, far from natural light. They moved carefully, likely with torches through narrow passages. Why did they go so far in? To perform rituals? To tell stories? To feel close to something ancient and powerful? Whatever the reason, they left more than just physical traces. They left clues to a world of meaning, a spiritual map layered over the physical one. Their travels weren't only about following food or fleeing cold. And through all of this, the Ice Age landscape itself loomed as both adversary and ally. The winds carried the scent of animals across miles. The stars, though unchanged from our own skies, served as silent guides across the plains. Even the ice had its gifts. Glacial melt created rich rivers, teeming with fish, and the grinding of glaciers exposed flint deposits crucial for tool-making. But it was unforgiving. One misstep could cost a life. A sudden storm, a fall, a broken leg out on the tundra. These were everyday dangers, and yet generation after generation endured. They adapted not by dominating the land, but by learning its rhythms. They became experts in a world most of us would not survive a week in. And as we continue deeper into their story, it becomes harder to see them as other. They weren't just prehistoric figures. They were us, stripped of convenience, but not of soul. As the millennia passed, survival became not just about adapting to the cold, but adapting to change itself. The climate during the Ice Age wasn't fixed. It fluctuated, sometimes dramatically. Periods of relative warmth, followed by sudden plunges into cold, could happen within a single lifetime. Forests could disappear beneath advancing permafrost, and rivers could dry up or shift course entirely. These changes required constant flexibility. A band of people might spend decades in a region, only to suddenly abandon it and head hundreds of kilometers away. But this wasn't blind wandering. It was informed movement, guided by ancestral memory, seasonal cues, and deep familiarity with the behavior of animals and the rhythms of the land. Over time, some groups began to follow regular migration routes, returning year after year to the same sites: caves with painted walls, riverbanks rich in fish, outcrops that held the perfect stone for blades. These places became more than just resources. They became part of their identity. Tool making, one of humanity's oldest technologies, became increasingly refined during this time. The people of the Ice Age weren't merely chipping rocks. They were engineering. They understood the grain of the stone, the angle of the strike, the importance of pressure versus percussion. Some tools were so finely crafted that modern flint knappers struggle to replicate them. In places like Solutré in France, elaborate stone points, leaf-shaped, thin, symmetrical, appear with precision that borders on artistry. These were more than weapons. They were expressions of skill, symbols of status, and possibly even items of trade. Bone tools, too, reached new levels of sophistication. Needles with drilled eyes, harpoons with barbs carved to hold fast in prey, ornaments etched with patterns that may have carried personal or cultural meaning. These weren't improvisations. They were the results of thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, passed down across countless firesides, in hands hardened by work and warmed by community. There's also evidence that Ice Age humans had a strong sense of aesthetics, not just function, but beauty. Beads made from seashells, animal teeth, ivory, and even fossils were carefully drilled and strung into necklaces, bracelets, and headdresses. Some were dyed with pigments like red ochre or manganese black. These materials were often found far from their natural sources, suggesting they were valued and traded over long distances. In certain burials, individuals were adorned with hundreds, even thousands of these beads. Such labor-intensive decoration likely carried meaning beyond appearance. It could have marked age, rank, family ties, or spiritual beliefs. But no matter the specific symbolism, it shows something important: the desire to be seen. Even in a world shaped by ice and hunger, people still found time to create, to adorn, to make something more of life than mere survival. It's also around this time that we begin to see the stirrings of what might be called domestication. Not of plants, which would come later, but of relationships. The bond between humans and animals took many forms, but the most enduring may be the partnership with dogs. Genetic and archaeological evidence suggests that wolves and humans began forming cooperative relationships at least 15,000 years ago, possibly even earlier. Some wolves may have scavenged near human camps, tolerated in exchange for early warning against predators or intruders. Over time, a mutual trust formed. Humans may have begun feeding the friendlier wolves, and in turn, the wolves began to accompany humans on hunts. These early dogs were not pets as we know them, but they were companions. In one burial site in Bonn, Germany, a young man and woman were interred with a dog. carefully placed beside them as if part of the family. That tells us something profound. Even then, connection transcended species. Hunting techniques evolved alongside the tools and the partnerships. In open steppe environments, groups developed sophisticated tracking and herding strategies. Some sites show signs of animals being driven into natural enclosures or off low cliffs, where they could be killed en masse, reducing the risk of injury to hunters. Others hint at long lines of posts or stone markers, possibly used to funnel herds. Coordinated hunting meant communication, planning, and trust, and every successful kill brought not just meat, but a host of valuable materials: hides for clothing and tents, sinew for bindings, bones for tools, and fat for fuel. Even the stomach of large animals might be used as a watertight container. Nothing was wasted. This efficiency wasn't just survival instinct, it was culture. The careful division of resources, the shared work of butchering and processing, the rituals surrounding a major hunt, these were the glue that held Ice Age communities together. And when there was time, in those rare moments, when the fire was strong, the food plentiful, and the snow quiet, people told stories, not just of hunts in danger, but of origins, spirits, the stars. We'll never know the exact shape of these stories, but their traces linger in the art, in the carvings, in the deliberate arrangements of bones and stones. Some caves even show evidence of staging, raised platforms, central spaces where people might have gathered. Perhaps they listened to someone speak by firelight, their voice echoing against the walls, retelling the old tales that made the world make sense. It's tempting to think of these stories as primitive, but they likely carried deep meaning. They taught lessons, preserved memories, bound people together. In those stories, fear and hope, death and wonder coexisted, just as they do in ours. If you walked across the Ice Age plains, past the mammoth steppe and into the shadow of a wind-sculpted ridge, you might find something quietly astonishing: a circle of stones, seemingly arranged with care. These weren't mere leftovers of a fire or a campsite. Some of these circles, discovered in places like Russia and Ukraine, were likely used for ceremonial purposes, not just practical ones. They may have been spaces where clans gathered to renew bonds, conduct seasonal rituals, or share information. These early gathering places suggest that Ice Age humans were not isolated tribes scattered by necessity, but nodes in a web of social life. They came together, perhaps at certain times of the year, to exchange goods, celebrate births, arrange partnerships, or mourn the dead. These moments of contact helped maintain genetic diversity, prevent conflict, and spread innovation. But maybe more than that, they helped people feel less alone in an enormous, freezing world. As we move further into this period, we begin to see stronger evidence of symbolic mapping, an ability to conceptualize space and time, not just through landmarks, but through shared memory. Carvings on bones found in Central Europe, for example, show recurring patterns that may relate to lunar cycles or seasonal changes. These weren't random doodles. The markings were deliberate, repeated, often grouped in sets of notches that seemed to track something with rhythm. Perhaps they were early calendars, counting the days between hunts, full moons, or the return of migrating animals. This suggests something extraordinary. Not only were Ice Age humans surviving in the moment, they were beginning to measure time itself. They were building systems to understand the world across weeks, months, and years, systems that required collective memory, cultural continuity, and perhaps even the beginnings of written thought, carved not into books but bone. We also see increased complexity in how groups use the land. Instead of living in a single site, many communities maintain networks of seasonal camps. There might be a summer hunting ground near a river, a winter shelter deep in a protected gorge, and spring camps near calving grounds of herd animals. These were known places, returned to generation after generation, rich with the residue of previous lives, old hearths, discarded tools, buried bones. In this way, the landscape itself became a kind of memory, an atlas of life events, of past triumphs and hardships. To a stranger, the site might look like any other patch of ground, but to those who had returned year after year, It was sacred space. They would know where a child had been born, where a friend had died, where the food had run out once long ago. The Ice Age world was harsh, but it was not faceless. It was deeply known, mapped not with lines, but with memory and meaning. The people of this age also demonstrated a remarkable ability to share and build upon ideas. One of the clearest examples of this comes from the evolution of tools and artistic motifs across vast distances. When a new type of blade or projectile point appears in one part of Europe, it often begins to show up, with slight variations, hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away, within a few generations. This is a strong indicator of cultural transmission, not just individuals migrating, but networks of exchange and imitation. Likewise, particular designs on ornaments or figurines sometimes crop up across distant regions, suggesting not just trade, but shared symbols. These connections didn't require cities, roads, or writing. They relied on memory, spoken word, and a culture of attentiveness. To adopt someone else's way of carving a blade or braiding a cord meant watching closely, practicing, and passing it on. This invisible thread of learning is what bound Ice Age people together across space and time. Even the way they approached the dangers of the world speaks to a deeper intelligence. Large predators still roamed freely. Cave lions, dire wolves, and massive cave bears were real threats. But humans rarely sought to kill them outright unless necessary. Instead, they avoided confrontation through timing, choosing shelters at the right moment, or burning fires at entrances to keep animals away. Evidence from cave systems suggests that humans and carnivores sometimes alternated use of the same spaces seasonally, bears in winter, humans in summer. This quiet negotiation with nature, not domination, but coexistence, shows an adaptive mindset we're only beginning to appreciate. It's easy to think of prehistoric people as conquerors of nature, but often they were its most attentive students. They knew when to stay, when to move, and when to let the forest or tundra reclaim a place once used. They didn't just live off the land, they listened to it. And perhaps that's one of the deepest truths about how humans survived the Ice Age. It wasn't just by crafting better weapons or building warmer shelters, though those things mattered. It was their ability to pay attention to each other, to the land, to the changes in wind or the shape of clouds, to the mood of an animal herd, to the glint of stone under frost. Survival came not from force, but from understanding. That mindset, that humility and sensitivity, is something we still carry, even if we've forgotten how to use it. When we trace the footsteps of these ancient people, in a cave wall smudged by ochre-covered fingers, in the worn path between a fire ring and a stream, we're not just studying the past, we're remembering something we've always known, that to live well in a wild and changing world, we must learn to see, to feel, and to remember. In the stillness of an Ice Age night, with stars scattered like frost across a black sky, and the breath of mammoths steaming into the air, silence carried meaning. It wasn't the absence of noise, it was the presence of awareness. Imagine families curled near the embers of a fading fire, listening to the creak of frozen branches or the distant call of wolves. In these moments, sound was a tool as much as a spear or knife. A snapped twig could mean danger. A sudden quiet from the herd nearby could signal a predator. Cavemen were trained not just to move silently, but to listen with extraordinary care. Their ears were tuned to patterns we've long since drowned out. The subtle shift in wind direction, the rhythm of hooves against dry tundra, or the crack of thin ice under a heavy foot. In a world without machines, silence was a space where information lived. It's likely that this heightened awareness extended far beyond the practical. We often forget that ancient humans didn't divide the world into natural and spiritual, the way modern people do. For them, the cry of an owl, the color of a cloud at dusk, or the curve of a riverbank might hold personal or even sacred significance. They read the world like a living text, one written not in letters, but in signs. In many ways, this kind of intuitive environmental literacy was their greatest survival trait. It allowed them to sense when herds were on the move, when weather patterns were shifting, or when to abandon a camp even before obvious signs appeared. Some of this came from observation, yes, but some likely came from a deeper sense, a quiet instinct passed down not through formal teaching, but through the act of simply living close to the earth. The best lessons weren't spoken, they were felt. We see hints of this mindset in the earliest carvings and symbolic marks left behind. Take the famous Lion Man figurine discovered in the Hohenstein-Stadel cave in Germany, carved from mammoth ivory and dated to around 40,000 years ago. It depicts a human figure with the head of a lion, a fusion of animal and man, strength and spirit. What does it mean? Some scholars believe it represents a shamanic figure, someone believed to cross the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. Others suggest it was a protector or even an ancestor spirit. But what matters most is what it tells us. These people imagined beings beyond the material world. They had inner lives rich enough to invent hybrids, myths, and symbols. That takes not only intelligence, but imagination, the ability to dream beyond what is immediately seen. In a harsh, dangerous world, imagination was a refuge, and perhaps a kind of power. Much of that imagination was carried in the form of gesture and body movement. Without written language, the body became a canvas of communication. Facial expressions, hand motions, posture, all of it mattered. In small groups where everyone knew one another, subtle cues could carry enormous weight. A raised eyebrow might signal caution. A hand on a shoulder might calm fear. And during hunts or moments of danger, silent signals likely replaced speech entirely. Even today, indigenous hunter-gatherer societies use rich systems of nonverbal communication, and it's likely Ice Age humans did the same. What's fascinating is how this form of expression often carries emotional clarity. Without words, people had to feel each other's intention. In that kind of world, empathy wasn't optional. It was survival. Knowing how someone was feeling, anxious, brave, uncertain, could mean the difference between a successful hunt or a tragic mistake. Sometimes, even the terrain itself seemed to hold memory. In certain parts of Europe, caves used repeatedly over thousands of years show layers upon layers of human activity: torch, soot on ceilings, handprints beneath newer paintings, bones buried under fresh sediment. These were places people returned to. Sacred spaces, maybe, or simply familiar ones. What must it have been like to enter a cave your grandparents had painted? To see their fingerprints on the stone? Did they speak their names aloud? Did they tell stories about who painted what and why? These places weren't just shelters. They were archives of art, of memory, of identity. Even today, when researchers stand in those same chambers, the weight of time is almost tangible. The silence isn't empty. It's filled with echoes, not just of sound, but of intention, attention, and presence. And then there's the fire, that ancient, flickering heart of every Ice Age community. Fire meant so much more than heat. It gave light in a world without electricity, security in a world filled with predators, and emotional warmth in a world shaped by cold. Around the fire, humans became human. They cooked together, crafted tools by firelight, told stories, laughed, argued, and learned. Fire made it possible to gather, to stop for a while and simply be. It transformed raw meat into sustenance, softened hides for clothing, and hardened points for spears. But beyond all that, fire gave time. Without fire, the night was dead space. With it, the night became a second world, quiet, intimate, and thoughtful. You could sit beside someone in the dark and share more than food. You could share silence, fear, dreams. You could share yourself. When we imagine the Ice Age, we often picture the cold first frostbitten winds, snow-choked valleys, endless white horizons. But that image leaves something out. Not every place was frozen. In fact, many regions where early humans thrived were pockets of relative warmth. Refugia, as scientists call them. These were sheltered valleys, southern slopes, riverbanks, or coastal plains, where the climate was milder, the vegetation denser, and life just a little easier. In these safe havens, people could stay longer, build more permanent shelters, and begin to develop seasonal rhythms. that bordered on the first hints of stability. These places became strongholds, from southern France to the Balkans, from Iberia to the Near East. In these zones, communities passed down not just survival skills, but deeper culture: how to tan hides more efficiently, how to dry and smoke meat for long winters, how to raise children with stories that had been told 1,000 times before. Even in the colder zones, humans found ways to make the land work for them. Snow itself could be used as insulation. Shelters dug into drifts or surrounded by piled snow created a thermal barrier, a trick used later by Inuit groups and likely understood, at least instinctively, by Ice Age humans. Animal hides were layered not just for warmth but for structure. A hide stretched tight over a frame could repel wind like a tent wall. Heated stones were used to warm sleeping areas, stones placed in the fire, then moved under bedding to radiate warmth through the night. These weren't simple tricks. They required planning, patience, and experimentation. Each new innovation, every time someone figured out a smarter way to carry water, to smoke meat without scorching it, to sew boots that didn't let in snow, that knowledge became part of a collective memory, passed from mother to daughter, from uncle to nephew, from old hunter to young apprentice. Layer by layer, survival became wisdom. But wisdom wasn't only practical, it was emotional. The stress of Ice Age life was relentless. Food was never guaranteed. Injury and illness were constant threats. Weather could turn deadly without warning, and yet people endured. That endurance came not just from skill, but from connection, from the bonds between people. A glance from an elder could reassure. A touch from a parent could comfort. A song, hummed quietly in the evening, could hold a group together like thread. These small acts mattered. They reduced fear, created calm, and reminded everyone that they belonged. You can see this in the way communities buried their dead, with tenderness, with offerings, with symbols. You can see it in the shared shelters, the communal fires, the overlapping handprints on cave walls. These weren't solitary lives. They were deeply entangled, in care, in memory, in meaning. It's in this context that we begin to understand why Ice Age humans created art. They didn't need to. A painting didn't bring food. A carved figurine didn't stop the cold. But they made them anyway, over and over. Deep inside caves, often far from any living space, they painted with purpose. Horses mid-gallop, mammoths with curling tusks, lions stalking prey. Some of these animals were rarely hunted. They were watched, admired, even feared. Some walls show the same animal painted again and again, almost like a prayer. Some show strange symbols, dots, grids, and zigzags that repeat across vast regions. These may have been calendars, stories, or spiritual markers. We may never decipher them, but what's clear is this: these paintings mattered. They weren't decoration, they were communication with each other, with the unknown, maybe with forces they couldn't name but deeply felt. And just maybe, the act of creating them was a kind of healing. We tend to think of medicine as a modern invention, but even Ice Age humans must have learned how to treat wounds, manage pain, and ease suffering. Across archaeological sites, traces of plant residues suggest the use of herbal remedies. Yarrow, for instance, which grows wild and has antiseptic properties. Some burials show traces of pollen, perhaps from medicinal flowers placed with the dead. Others suggest that people understood the difference between healing wounds with clean fat versus sealing them with pitch or resin. Even pain itself might have been managed with chewing bark, heating stones, or applying cold snow to numb injury. And just as importantly, there was emotional medicine. The quiet presence of another human, the comfort of shared touch, the rituals that gave meaning to suffering. When one person was sick, others took care, not because they had to, but because they could. In that way, they were not so different from us. Perhaps the most underappreciated element of Ice Age survival was hope. Not optimism, not the belief that everything would always be fine, but hope, the quiet persistence that life could still be good, that tomorrow might bring a successful hunt, that a child born in a bitter winter might live to see spring. that even in the face of hunger or frostbite or grief, the fire would be lit again, and someone would be there beside you. Hope lived in the small things, the first buds of spring plants poking through snow, the distant call of migrating birds, the birth of a baby. It was in the ritual of passing knowledge, the rhythm of walking familiar trails, the moment of laughter after danger had passed, and that hope, steady, enduring, passed hand to hand like a burning coal, may be the truest reason we are here at all. As the Ice Age began its slow retreat, subtle changes unfolded across the landscape. Glaciers that had once dominated entire continents began to shrink back, inch by inch, carving deep valleys and leaving behind freshwater lakes and new terrain. Grasslands gave way to forests, rivers swelled with meltwater, and animals that had vanished from some regions returned, following the spread of vegetation. For the humans living through this change, it must have felt like the world itself was shifting beneath their feet, not overnight, but steadily, like the turning of a great slow page. The places they had known were different now. The old trails vanished under new growth. Familiar herds changed their migratory patterns. In some areas, people were forced to abandon the mammoth steppe they had known for generations and adapt to life beneath the trees. This transition didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly enough for traditions to evolve, but it was change, and for people whose survival depended on deep familiarity with the land, that change meant everything. This shift toward new ecosystems introduced new challenges and new opportunities. Forests meant smaller game animals, deer, boar, and elk, instead of mammoth or bison. Hunting methods had to adjust. Spears thrown over open plains were less useful in thick woods, so people began to rely more on traps, snares, and perhaps most importantly, the bow and arrow. The bow may have first appeared during this transitional period, a tool well suited for quick, silent hunting in dense forests. Lightweight, easy to carry, and deadly at a distance, it marked a turning point in how humans interacted with their environment. With it came new forms of tool-making, new types of arrowheads, and a shift in the kinds of animals hunted. Smaller game also meant that hunting needed to happen more frequently, and gathering became a larger part of the food strategy. Nuts, berries, edible roots, and freshwater fish all became increasingly important to survival, especially in the warmer months. Clothing and shelter also adapted to the changing world. In a forested climate, hides needed to repel rain more than retain heat. Flexible garments became preferable to the thick, layered winter suits used on the open tundra. Shelters could now use wood, not just as fuel, but as frame and structure. Simple lean-tos, wattle and daub huts, or bark-covered shelters could be constructed quickly, using nearby resources. These weren't just functional. They were spaces shaped by memory and meaning. In some cases, people may have returned to the same forest clearing year after year, rebuilding their shelter on the same patch of ground. Children would grow up recognizing that spot, not just as a place to sleep, but as part of who they were. These small homes, ringed with firelight and the scent of wood smoke, were more than structures. They were containers for life itself, for laughter, for warmth, for stories whispered in the dark. With the melting of the glaciers came water, rivers flowing freer, lakes expanding, rainfall becoming more regular. This change opened up a new world of food and movement. People began to exploit waterways in new ways. Rafts and dugout canoes may have allowed for early fishing and transport across rivers. The abundance of fish, frogs, mollusks, and birds made wetlands especially valuable ecosystems. Bones of pike and salmon have been found in human settlements from this time, sometimes alongside finely made fishhooks or nets weighted with stones. Fishing was more than a source of food. It was a chance to stay in one place longer, to build up stores, to prepare for leaner times, and perhaps it was even a moment of quiet. Imagine a figure sitting by a stream at dusk, rod or spear in hand, watching the ripples, listening to the birdsong, hearing their own breath slow in rhythm with the water. In a world of constant movement, moments like these were rare and precious. As forests spread, so did the types of raw materials available. Bark could be used for containers, birch resin as glue, and wood itself, especially from pine and ash, as fuel, tools, and even building supports. Plant life also provided medicine and nourishment in new forms. Willow bark remained a staple for pain relief. Nettles could be boiled and eaten, or turned into fibers for cordage, and certain mushrooms, seeds, and herbs carried properties that, while invisible to the eye, were understood through generations of trial, error, and storytelling. Not all plants were helpful, of course. Some were poisonous, even deadly. But the ability to distinguish between healing and harm was a kind of knowledge guarded closely and passed on carefully. In some groups, this knowledge might have been the domain of a particular elder, someone seen as wise, experienced, and perhaps even mystical. Whether called healer, shaman, or simply grandmother, their role was as critical as any hunter or warrior. Throughout all of these changes, one thing remained constant: the need for belonging. Whether on the open steppe or in the shadowed forest, humans needed one another. Every adaptation, every new tool, every innovation was shared, passed hand to hand, story to story. And in those quiet moments, in the middle of the night, with an owl calling from somewhere in the trees and the fire turning to embers, people held on to each other, sometimes literally, sometimes with a glance, or a word, or a lullaby hummed into a sleeping child's ear. These are the pieces of Ice Age life we cannot dig out of the ground or carbon date. But they were real, they were the heartbeat of survival. And they echo forward, still, in the way we gather around our own fires, even if those fires are now stories told through headphones in the dark, while someone somewhere drifts gently off to sleep. As humans settled into this changing landscape, they began to leave behind not just physical tools, but social footprints, behaviors, and patterns that marked the dawn of more complex human culture. Some of the most fascinating discoveries from this time aren't weapons or shelters, but spaces, areas where people repeatedly returned, not just for food or shelter, but for gathering. These sites show signs of communal fires, caches of food shared between groups, and even small areas that may have served specific purposes: tool-making zones, bone discard piles, or places where ochre was ground and mixed. Such spatial organization points to a deeper shift from purely surviving to shaping the spaces around them. In a sense, they weren't just reacting to nature anymore. They were beginning to claim pieces of it as their own, not in ownership, but in presence. These places were remembered, returned to, and passed on. They became a kind of early geography of belonging. Trade, too, begins to emerge more clearly in this period. Long-distance movement of materials, like obsidian, flint, marine shells, and even amber, suggests an active network of exchange between groups who may never have met directly. What was traded wasn't always practical. Some items, like polished stones or shaped pendants, seem to have held symbolic or aesthetic value. This implies something powerful: that Ice Age humans not only needed each other for survival, but also valued beauty, symbolism, and connection beyond utility. The presence of exotic items in burial sites, things clearly not local to the area, indicates that being part of a larger network was meaningful. It gave people identity beyond the campfire, a sense of placement in a wider world. It also suggests trust, the ability to exchange, share, and perhaps form alliances. These weren't closed, isolated groups. They were strands in a web stretching across a cold but connected continent. Within these communities, social roles were more fluid than we might assume. While certain tasks naturally fell to different age groups or physical strengths, there's evidence that many skills were shared. A young girl might learn to scrape hides or set traps. An older man might pass on stories or teach how to knap stone. The division of labor was likely practical, but flexible. There was no room for rigid boundaries when every hand counted. What mattered more was cooperation and continuity. Teaching was not done in classrooms, but in the rhythm of daily life, through demonstration, repetition, and shared labor. The young learned by watching, by imitating, by doing. And because survival depended on it, mistakes were corrected, not with punishment, but with patience. Every person was both a learner and a teacher. Knowledge wasn't hoarded, it was preserved by sharing, like fire passed from one torch to the next. In this way, culture became the real inheritance. Not just physical objects or genes, but practices, rituals, and ways of being. One of the clearest signs of this comes from burials. In multiple Ice Age sites, the dead were buried with consistent patterns, red ochre sprinkled across the body, specific objects placed in particular positions, grave goods that reflected age, gender, or social role. These repeated elements weren't random. They point to shared beliefs, maybe even shared myths or cosmologies. And though we can't reconstruct those beliefs word for word, their presence reveals something intimate. The people of the Ice Age were thinking about death, not just fearing it, but preparing for it, honoring it, and making meaning from it. In that quiet act, laying a body to rest, choosing what objects to send with them, we glimpse something profoundly human, a recognition that life matters, and that it continues somehow in memory or in spirit. What's equally striking is that alongside all this symbolic richness, people continued to innovate. New methods for storing food began to appear. Pits dug into the ground to preserve meat in colder temperatures, or drying racks built to smoke fish and game. Simple woven baskets may have allowed for gathering and storing plants. Clay-lined hearths made fires more efficient, concentrating heat and protecting surrounding areas. In some regions, evidence of early ceramics begins to emerge. Not full pottery, but clay figurines and baked objects that may have been both decorative and experimental. These tiny steps hint at what would come in later millennia. Agriculture, pottery, permanent settlements, but none of it appeared suddenly. It grew from this slow layering of knowledge, creativity, and adaptation. Each generation left behind a little more than it received, not always in size or abundance, but in subtlety, in skill, in awareness. And through it all, people laughed. They must have. We can't find laughter in the fossil record, but it's there, implied in the playful carvings, the carefully made ornaments, the communal cooking fires. Humans are social creatures. We share stories, but we also share jokes, mimic voices, exaggerate movements to make each other smile. In a world of such intensity, survival, death, danger, laughter was not a luxury. It was a release, a form of bonding, a way of making meaning bearable. Imagine a child tripping over their own feet and making the others laugh, or someone imitating an animal to lift spirits after a failed hunt. That laughter would echo across the snow, carried by the wind, and it would be just as essential as any tool, because survival wasn't just about food and shelter. It was about spirit, and the human spirit, even under a sky full of ice, found ways to stay light. In the quieter corners of Ice Age life, there were patterns that shaped the days, not grand discoveries, but steady repetitions. Each morning, fires were stirred back to life with glowing coals protected through the night. Ash was brushed away, water collected, hides checked for damage. Children fetched sticks or mimicked adult tasks. The hunters, if they hadn't already left at first light, prepared their weapons in silence. The rhythm of daily survival may seem monotonous from the outside, but for those living it, it was a ritual, and rituals give shape to time. They create moments of certainty in an uncertain world. Even in small acts, tying a cord the same way each morning, packing a hunting pouch in a familiar order, there was comfort. In a place where nature was unpredictable and often cruel, these small human routines offered something precious: stability. That stability extended to relationships. Bonds between people in Ice Age groups were not just social, they were emotional lifelines. Trust wasn't optional. When a person stood beside you on a hunt or watched over your child by the fire, their decisions could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. So people formed strong, sometimes lifelong, alliances. These bonds weren't always tied to blood. They were formed through shared experience. A good hunting partner might become closer than a sibling. A widowed elder might be embraced as part of a new family. The idea of kinship was elastic, defined not only by genetics, but by care, responsibility, and time. It's possible that language itself evolved partly to serve this need, to express not just warnings and commands, but emotions, promises, and dreams. Language allowed people to say, "I'll return," this is yours, or simply, you matter. Food, as always, was central, not only as nourishment, but as symbol. A successful hunt was more than luck. It was proof that the group could endure. When game was brought back, it wasn't hoarded, it was shared. The best cuts may have gone to elders, children, or those recovering from illness. This wasn't just generosity, it was strategy. Everyone's health mattered, because every person contributed something. Even the smallest child or the slowest elder had a role. If not today, then tomorrow. Food sharing reinforced bonds and reminded people that they were part of something larger. And the act of eating itself, sitting together, warming hands around a fire, biting into roasted meat or boiled roots, was deeply social. It was one of the few moments when the dangers of the world receded and people could simply exist together, alive and present. Sometimes, food itself became symbolic. In certain sites, remnants of feasting have been found. Large gatherings, where multiple animals were butchered, cooked, and consumed. These weren't routine meals, they were events. Maybe they marked a seasonal migration, the return of a group from distant hunting grounds, or the change from winter to spring. In such moments, food transformed into ritual. Stories were told, songs were sung, tools and ornaments may have been exchanged. These gatherings were likely full of sound, laughter, song, the hiss of meat on fire, the clatter of bones. For Ice Age humans, these rare feasts may have reminded them of something crucial, that they were not alone, that other groups were out there, living through the same hardships, chasing the same herds, honoring the same ancestors. In a world of wide distances and deep cold, that sense of connection was sacred. Music may have been one of the oldest and most universal forms of that connection. Flutes made from bird bones have been found in German caves, carefully hollowed and drilled with finger holes. Some of these instruments date back over 35,000 years. What were they playing? We'll never know, but the presence of music tells us something vital. That Ice Age people valued sound, not just for warning or signaling, but for beauty. Music could soothe a child, accompany a ritual, or mark the rhythm of work. It could lift spirits when morale was low, or guide a group through the long hours of walking. Even if the songs themselves are lost, the instinct behind them survives. We still sing when we are lonely. We hum when we are afraid. We beat drums when we celebrate. The same breath that carried a melody through an Ice Age cave carries your voice when you sing in the car, in the shower, or softly to someone you love. And through all these layers of activity, survival, celebration, sorrow, humans remained deeply aware of the sky above. The stars, unspoiled by city light, must have been brilliant, clear patterns etched across the darkness, returning night after night with the precision of clockwork. There's evidence that early people tracked lunar cycles and even marked the solstices. Perhaps they used the stars to orient themselves or to remember seasons. Perhaps they told stories about constellations, hunters, beasts, or spirits walking the sky. Looking up in the cold dark with the fire crackling behind them, early humans must have wondered what those distant lights meant. And maybe in the stars, as in everything else around them, they found signs. They found reassurance. They found the sense that they were part of something bigger, that despite the cold and danger, they belonged, not just to the land, but to the cosmos itself. There's something almost sacred in the act of watching the seasons change. And for Ice Age humans, it wasn't just beautiful, it was essential. They didn't use calendars or clocks, but they read the world like a living schedule. The budding of a certain plant, the behavior of a specific animal, the color of the sky at dusk. These were their signals, migration patterns, mating seasons, and even the availability of certain resources were tracked through environmental cues. In a sense, they lived by a symphony of signs, each one telling them when to move, when to stay, when to prepare. These patterns were memorized, passed down, and quietly tested against each new year. And when something changed, when a bird arrived late, or the river froze earlier than expected, it was noticed. These people weren't just living in nature, they were in conversation with it, listening constantly, never assuming, always adapting. Some Ice Age sites show signs of deliberate marking, stones arranged in alignment with the solstices, or carvings that may track lunar phases. These suggest that timekeeping wasn't just practical, it was also symbolic. Maybe certain days were sacred. Maybe the full moon was the right time for a journey or a gathering. Maybe the return of the sun after the longest night marked something more than warmth. Maybe it meant renewal. These cycles helped early humans feel connected to something larger than themselves. When the world was frozen and harsh, these turning points offered hope. The sun would return, the herd would come back, the child would grow. Their world moved in cycles, and so did they. Even death wasn't seen as final. Not entirely. Many cultures buried their dead facing east, toward the sunrise, as though they too would rise again someday. In that choice, we glimpse a belief in something enduring. It's around this period that we also see a shift in the relationship between humans and animals. Until now, animals had mostly been hunted, revered, feared. But as the climate softened and food sources diversified, new relationships began to form. One of the most compelling is the growing evidence of domesticated dogs. Wolves had long followed human camps, scavenging scraps, watching from a distance. But slowly, some drew closer, not through force, but through trust. The calmer, more social wolves were tolerated, then fed, then kept, and in return, they warned of danger, helped with hunts, and offered warmth and company. Over generations, these wolves changed, physically and behaviorally, becoming dogs. This wasn't just a new tool. It was the birth of companionship, a bond that offered emotional comfort as much as practical help. To imagine a child growing up with a dog at their side 14,000 years ago is to realize just how old that love truly is. That same shift toward deeper connection appears in art. Figurines from this era begin to show not just animals, but people, stylized, symbolic, even affectionate. The famous Venus figures, carved from ivory or stone, emphasize fertility, nurture, and human form. These weren't portraits, they were symbols of life, of continuity, of reverence for the body that bears the future. Other carvings show human-animal hybrids, possibly representations of spirits, ancestors, or inner visions. These objects were often carried, placed in burials, or left in caves, not just to be admired, but to serve a purpose. They may have been tokens of protection, tools of ritual, or offerings to unseen forces. But always, they reflect a mind that sees meaning beneath the surface, a mind that looks at stone or ivory and sees not just material, but memory, desire, and the mysteries that words can't fully reach. Burials from this period continue to show tenderness and ritual. In one remarkable case, a teenager was laid to rest in a grave lined with red ochre, surrounded by hundreds of ivory beads, fox teeth, and carved pendants. The care taken in this burial, the time it would have required, the resources devoted, tells us something deeply human. This young person was loved, their death mattered, and in that act of mourning, the community revealed something essential. Their emotional world was just as vivid as their physical one. Grief was not hidden or ignored. It was marked, shared, and perhaps softened through ritual. And maybe that ritual gave structure to the pain, a way to move through it, to carry it. We often think of prehistory as emotionless, but that's never been true. The evidence says otherwise. These were people who loved, who lost, and who did their best to hold each other through both. As we follow them forward in time, what emerges most clearly is this: they were becoming more than survivors. They were becoming storytellers. People who could shape the world not just through tools, but through ideas. Every fire they lit, every path they marked, every symbol they carved into stone, it was all part of a growing legacy. A story not told in words, but in action. A story that you and I are part of. Because in so many ways, nothing has changed. We still gather around light in the darkness. We still tell stories to understand ourselves. We still reach for each other when life becomes uncertain. So as we continue this journey through the ancient world, remember, it's not just their story, it's ours. By now, we can begin to see something taking shape. Not just a record of how early humans survived, but a portrait of who they were becoming. No longer defined only by the struggle to stay alive, these people were beginning to live with intention. In the patterns of their shelters, the care of their burials, the memory embedded in their art, we see the roots of what we would one day call civilization. Not in cities or monuments, but in the structure of relationships, the consistency of traditions, and the growing sense of legacy. They didn't build empires. They built trust. They didn't write books. They remembered stories. And through those stories, passed across generations, across firelight and winter nights, they preserved more than survival strategies. They preserved identity. One of the clearest signs of this expanding identity is the emergence of specialized knowledge. While most members of a group shared in the basic tasks of daily life, hunting, gathering, tool-making, some individuals likely became recognized for certain skills. A particularly skilled tracker, a patient toolmaker, a person with deep knowledge of plants and healing. These people may have been sought out, respected, perhaps even honored. In some communities, this kind of specialization was probably formalized through ritual, a person becoming a kind of healer, leader, or storyteller over time. This didn't mean hierarchy the way we understand it today. It meant a shifting balance, where knowledge gave shape to influence. Those who understood the sky, the animals, the hidden workings of illness and recovery, they held a certain kind of power, not to command, but to guide. That guidance often came through ritual. And ritual, more than anything else, shows us how early humans made meaning. They didn't separate the practical from the sacred. Lighting a fire, preparing a hunt, burying a loved one, each could be wrapped in layers of belief. Certain gestures might be repeated the same way every time. Specific objects, a red stone, a carved antler, a string of beads, might be passed from hand to hand before an event. These weren't empty superstitions. They were frameworks. They helped people understand the unseen, why a hunt failed, why a child fell ill, why the seasons changed. And in those explanations, even if imperfect, there was comfort. Ritual turned chaos into order, fear into something that could be held, shared, and spoken aloud. There are echoes of this in the design of spaces. Some Ice Age dwellings show signs of interior organization. Food stored in one area, tools in another, sleeping areas arranged around the fire. This may not sound revolutionary, but it suggests something important. People were designing not just for shelter, but for living well. They were creating zones of purpose, places for different aspects of life to unfold. Some hearths were surrounded by ochre marks or stone arrangements, possibly designating them for special use. Certain caves show evidence of being used only for rituals or art, while others were lived in daily. This spatial awareness, the recognition that a space can hold memory, meaning, and function, is a form of mental sophistication that often goes unnoticed, but it's everywhere in the archaeological record. And it tells us something beautiful. Even in the coldest places, people made homes, not just shelters. Another sign of increasing complexity is the presence of long-distance movement, not tied to immediate need. In several sites across Europe, artifacts appear that could not have been locally sourced. Materials like Baltic amber, Mediterranean shells, or rare volcanic obsidian. These didn't travel alone. They moved through people, through exchanges, through stories. A single bead carved hundreds of miles away might pass through a dozen hands before reaching its final home. That bead wasn't just an ornament. It was a thread, a connection, a symbol of trust and contact across vast distances. The very existence of these items suggests networks of communication far more intricate than we once imagined. Ice Age people didn't live in isolated pockets. They knew of others. They exchanged more than goods. They exchanged ideas. And those ideas traveled in the most enduring form of all, language. While we may never recover the exact words spoken by people 20,000 or 30,000 years ago, we know they had the cognitive tools to speak in full language, complex grammar, metaphor, tone, and nuance. All of it likely flourished. These weren't simple grunts. or single-syllable commands. These were full, expressive systems capable of carrying not just information, but emotion. Through language, people could share memory, plan for the future, comfort the grieving, and inspire the fearful. In many ways, language is our first shared technology, not built from stone or bone, but from breath. And it was that technology, more than any tool, that made everything else possible. With it, they carried the world in their voices, and with it, they made sure that nothing was truly lost. As we follow these ancient lives further, it becomes clear that their intelligence was not merely technical, it was relational. They understood not only how to shape a flint blade or construct a shelter, but how to hold a group together, how to read someone's eyes in silence, how to comfort a grieving parent or calm a frightened child. This emotional intelligence, this awareness of each other's needs, moods, and inner worlds, was just as critical to survival as any physical skill. In a world where everything depended on cooperation, the ability to resolve tension, to forgive, to encourage, to lead with gentleness, was often what kept people alive. These were not cold, stoic survivors. They were warm, deeply feeling humans, whose daily life was a quiet balance between endurance and connection. Children were especially important to this continuity. Their presence offered not just hope, but meaning. In cave sites where footprints have been preserved, pressed into soft clay, tens of thousands of years ago, we often find the prints of young children alongside those of adults. Sometimes they walk side by side. Sometimes they wander off slightly, then return. These small tracks tell a silent story, that children were not hidden away or protected from the world, but brought into it, taught from it. They learned by doing, by touching, by watching, by failing, and trying again. Adults didn't just teach skills, they shared life. A child might learn to recognize an animal track, not because it was taught as a lesson, but because it was pointed out with a smile during a walk. The landscape was their classroom, and survival was a lesson written in footprints. What's remarkable is how early humans developed tools, not only for hunting, but for living. Scrapers designed to clean hides, awls for piercing holes in leather, grinding stones to process seeds and roots. All of these were refinements that allowed people to not just survive the winter, but prepare for it. By tanning hides properly, they made garments that lasted. By drying berries or storing bone marrow, they built reserves. Some groups may have even smoked or dried meat in pits lined with ash and stone, keeping food edible for weeks. These practices required foresight, trial and error, and a shared memory that spanned generations. One person might invent a new way of stretching a hide tighter. Another might notice that drying meat near a certain tree added a better flavor. Slowly, bit by bit, knowledge grew. Not because it was stored in books, but because it lived in people. As the Ice Age world warmed and changed, so too did the rhythm of life. Some groups began to stay longer in one place, with more consistent access to food, from fish, from plants, from smaller game. The need for constant movement eased. This semi-sedentary life allowed for new forms of creativity. We begin to see more evidence of ornamentation, pierced teeth worn on necklaces, patterned beads made from bones or shells, small animal carvings smoothed by handling. These weren't just decorative, they carried meaning. A certain design might identify a person's lineage or clan. A unique bead could mark a rite of passage, and in many cases, these objects were buried with their owners, a final gesture of identity, of memory held close even in death. These little things, carried and worn, tell us that Ice Age people weren't just surviving, they were living lives filled with meaning. And while we can't know what they believed in the way we know what they ate or where they slept, we can feel the weight of their beliefs in the choices they made. Some caves show signs of intentional closure, stones stacked to block an entrance, or pathways obscured after a ritual. This suggests that places had power, that spaces were respected and protected. Perhaps only certain people could enter them. Perhaps rituals had to be performed in silence, in darkness, away from the noise of daily life. These choices hint at a sense of sacredness, not imposed by religion in the way we think of it today, but emerging from lived experience. The cave became a womb of memory, the fire a portal between seen and unseen worlds, and whether or not they had gods, they clearly had reverence for the hunt, for the land, for each other. Even today, when archaeologists step into those ancient spaces, they report a feeling that goes beyond discovery. Something quiet, something still, standing where a person once stood, 30,000 years ago, seeing the ash from a fire they lit, or the handprint they pressed against a wall. It's hard not to feel the thinness of time, that human left a mark, not for us, but for their own reasons, to remember, to ask, to say, I am here. And yet now, all this time later, we respond. We recognize them. We recognize ourselves. Because the greatest truth of the Ice Age is not the cold, or the danger, or even the ingenuity. It's the continuity. The fact that they lived in ways that still live in us. That their fears, their joys, their longings, they never really disappeared. They've only changed shape. As the great glaciers gradually released their grip on the earth, the landscapes that had been locked in ice began to breathe again. Hills once buried in permafrost sprouted moss and grass. Forests crept northward. Rivers, swollen with meltwater, carved new paths across the land. And with this change, animals moved. Herds of reindeer and horses shifted their ranges. Bison followed the grass. Fish flooded into lakes and streams, newly freed from ice, for the humans who had survived the worst of the cold. This transformation opened new doors. They could return to old places, explore new ones. They could follow the herds into unfamiliar valleys, or linger where fish and game were suddenly abundant. But change, even when welcome, brings questions. Would the old ways still work? Would the rhythms they'd known for generations still hold true in this new world? Many adapted by becoming even more flexible. Some groups continued to follow migratory patterns, moving with the seasons as they always had. Others began to settle longer in places where food was reliable. This wasn't farming, not yet, but it was a subtle shift in mindset, staying put. Even for a few months at a time, allowed for a new kind of investment. People began to build more permanent shelters, huts framed with wood, lined with grass and hides, insulated with earth or bark. In these spaces, they could store food, keep tools organized, raise children in greater safety. With a base to return to, life began to stretch out in new directions. The cycle of existence grew not just around movement, but around home. The idea of this place began to mean something deeper, not just safety, but identity. In places where the earth thawed early and forests thickened, people also began to gather and process new types of food. They collected wild grains, ground seeds with stone tools, boiled starchy roots. These practices took time. They required waiting, watching, knowing which plants were edible, when they were ripe, and how to prepare them. Some of this knowledge may have come from earlier generations, who had survived brief warm spells, only to retreat when the cold returned. But now, with the glaciers pulling back for good, that knowledge became foundational. A group could survive not only by chasing meat, but by knowing the land, by understanding which bark eased pain, which mushrooms to avoid, which insects were high in fat and protein. And just like the tools they carried, this knowledge wasn't random. It was shared, tested, refined, a quiet science passed from hands to memory. With more stable camps and richer food sources came a deeper sense of social structure. Extended families could remain together longer. Bonds between neighboring groups could grow stronger. And with these tighter-knit communities came more opportunity for ceremony, for shared identity. Music, dance, and story likely became more than entertainment. They became glue. A song passed down over generations could serve as a map, a prayer, a warning. A ritual dance around a fire might mark a child's first hunt or the return of spring. These weren't empty performances. They were vessels of memory, a way to carry identity when words faded or generations passed. In this way, every gesture, every shared meal, every repeated story became an anchor, tethering people not just to each other, but to the land and time they moved through. What's fascinating is that during this warmer period, we also begin to see more human creativity etched into the physical world, not only in deep caves, but out in the open. Rock carvings, shallow engravings on boulders, decorative patterns on bone tools. All of them hint at a growing need to leave a mark. These weren't always grand expressions. Sometimes it was a zigzag pattern, a repeated curve, or the outline of an animal. But the message was clear. Someone was here. Someone felt enough connection to this spot, this moment, to leave a sign. Not for survival, not for utility, but for meaning. Perhaps they believed the place itself had spirit. Perhaps they believed that marking it would give power, or protection, or simply remembrance. Whatever the reason, these carvings endure like fingerprints, silent witnesses to moments we can never fully recover, but can still feel. In all of this, the most profound thing might be how little these early people expected from the land, and how much they gave back to it in return. They took what they needed, yes, but often with care. They respected migration patterns, harvested plants with restraint, buried their dead with ceremony rather than leaving remains exposed. In some cases, they even avoided hunting in sacred areas, places where certain animals were believed to dwell in spirit form, or where the ancestors were said to watch. This reverence wasn't organized religion as we know it, but something older, quieter. It was the understanding that survival isn't only about dominance, it's about relationship. And that ancient lesson, whispered across generations in the flicker of firelight and the hush of snow, still waits for us to remember it. The passing of the Ice Age didn't mark the end of struggle, it simply changed its shape. As the climate warmed, competition didn't disappear, it shifted. New animals appeared in once frozen landscapes: red deer, wild boar, elk, and smaller game that required different strategies to catch. These creatures moved differently than mammoths or bison. They were faster, more agile, and more adapted to woodland terrain. In response, humans refined their tools even further. They created lighter, more aerodynamic spears, and developed new hunting aids, such as the atlatl, a spear thrower that extended the range and force of a throw. With it, a hunter could deliver a precise, deadly strike from a safe distance. This invention wasn't just clever. It was the result of thousands of years of adaptation, the quiet layering of innovation upon necessity, each new idea built from countless observations and shared experiments. As forests grew denser, visibility dropped, and hunting became less about long chases and more about stealth. The rhythm of the hunt changed. Humans began setting traps more frequently: pits, snares, deadfalls made from logs and stones. These required patience, not just to build, but to monitor. A trap could be set days in advance, baited with meat, or scented with crushed herbs. Some may have even used fire to flush animals toward ambush points, creating a coordinated strategy that blurred the line between hunter and environment. These methods demanded planning, timing, and collaboration. One person alone could rarely succeed. It took a team, and more importantly, it took trust. Everyone had to play their part, from the scout who tracked the herd to the elder who remembered the best place for a snare. This was survival through strategy, not brute force. Water, too, became increasingly central. As ice melted and fresh water spread across the land, rivers and lakes became both highways and pantries. Humans learned to read the flow, to know where fish gathered, where birds nested, where reeds could be pulled and woven into baskets. Stone weights used to anchor fishing nets have been found near these water sources, along with finely worked bone harpoons and carved hooks. In some areas, people built fish traps from woven branches, or set up simple weirs to guide fish into narrow channels. These quiet technologies show how humans continued to shift from a solely nomadic way of life towards something more balanced, a life where waiting was just as valuable as chasing, where observation yielded more than exertion. In this way, the riverbanks and lakesides became classrooms, gathering spots, and sources of abundance. With this new abundance came time. Time not just to survive, but to reflect. Some Ice Age sites contain objects that seem to serve no direct purpose. Pebbles polished, smoothed by hand, carved figurines with no clear use, geometric shapes scratched into stone. These artifacts are easy to overlook, but they hint at something extraordinary. Early expressions of curiosity. Maybe these were toys, or talismans, or even the first inklings of symbolic counting. But more than that, they reveal that people had enough space in their lives to wonder. Wonder about the stars, about death, about where animals went when they vanished, about the meaning of dreams. In some places, bones have been arranged in patterns, or pigments poured in deliberate arcs across cave floors, gestures that seem more ceremonial than practical. These weren't mistakes, they were messages. Not to us, but to themselves. Proof that the mind of Ice Age humanity was not just busy, it was awake. In the still moments, when the fire had burned low and the hunt was behind them, early humans likely turned inward. Sitting beside their companions, animal and human alike, they may have traced the arc of the moon, or watched a child sleeping, or run a hand along the wall of a cave etched by an ancestor long gone. These moments weren't marked in history, but they were real. They're what made the hardship worth enduring. Connection, memory, beauty, stillness. In those flickering hours, someone might have whispered a story, humming a tune that no one remembered learning, but everyone somehow knew they didn't need parchment or metal to build meaning. They carried it in their breath, in their hands, in their stories. And through those stories, they created continuity, a thread stretching from the very first spark struck against stone, all the way to us. Even now, that thread remains. Every time we look up at the night sky and wonder, we echo their gaze. Every time we gather around light, around warmth, around each other, we continue their ritual. They lived through cold we cannot imagine, through hunger, through fear, but they also lived through laughter, through love, through hope. And as the earth turned warmer and greener beneath their feet, they didn't just endure, they evolved. They remembered, they created, they dreamed, and their dreams, though silent now, still shape the world we wake in. The more we look at Ice Age life, the more we realize it wasn't only about the external world, the hunt, the cold, the survival. It was also about the internal landscape. These early humans didn't live just in space, they lived in time. They understood it through the rising and falling of the sun, through the turning of seasons, through cycles written into the land itself. But they also understood time as memory. In every tradition passed on, in every familiar trail walked again, in every story told to a child, time was stretched, expanded, made sacred. There were moments when the past and the present seemed to fold into each other, when a fire was lit in the same place as it had been the year before, or the same words were spoken at the beginning of a journey. Something more than routine was happening. It was remembrance, and remembrance is its own kind of survival. Even footsteps could carry memory. In sites like Le Tuc de Dubert and the Cave of Neo, deep inside the stone, far from any living space, footprints from children and adults still pressed softly into the floor. The earth there was soft, clay-like, protected from weather. The prints are preserved in astonishing clarity. Toes, arches, even the drag marks where a heel slipped or a foot pivoted. These tracks don't tell us what the people were doing in a technical sense, but they tell us everything in a human sense. A child dancing, a person walking slowly, then turning back, a moment shared. They weren't carving tools or storing meat down there. They were doing something else, something that mattered enough to walk that far in, barefoot or with soft leather coverings, through silence and shadow. Some believe these were rituals. Others say ceremonies or games. Whatever they were, they show us the interior life of people we'll never meet. And somehow that's enough. Communication must have been a deeply layered experience, not only through spoken language, but through tone, gesture, timing, and proximity. In a small group, you didn't need to say everything aloud. A glance could mean, be ready. A hand raised slowly could mean, wait. Over time, a vocabulary of motion likely emerged, shaped by necessity and refined by repetition. In the quiet of the forest or the vastness of the plains, silence became a kind of eloquence. And beneath it all, there was voice. The human voice, not just a tool for naming, but for bonding. It was used to soothe babies, to warn friends, to retell hunts, to sing to the stars. It echoed in caves, it filled tents, it drifted across snowy hills, and in those voices, something even larger was carried: emotion, fear, joy, longing, pride. All of it passed between people like fire from one torch to another. Tools may have fed the body, but rhythm fed the spirit. There's evidence that early humans used bone flutes not just for melody, but for rhythm, pulsing beats that matched the tempo of walking, of working, of breathing. Rhythm gave life structure. It made hard work lighter. It made memory easier to retain. You can almost imagine a group preparing a shelter for winter, each person working in sync to the rhythm of a chant, a shared beat that stitched them together. Maybe this is why music appears wherever humans are found, no matter the time period or geography. It gives form to feeling. It moves emotion out into the air, where others can hear it, join it, carry it forward. And perhaps, in this way, song was the first story, a memory that didn't need to be written down, only remembered together. The physical world reflected these patterns. Objects made by Ice Age humans often follow repeating forms: spiral carvings, notched lines, symmetrical figures. These weren't just decorations, they were expressions of something inside, of balance, of order, of harmony. They may have served as records, counting days or tracking cycles, but they were also artistic. The impulse to make something beautiful is not separate from the impulse to survive. It's part of it. A person who took time to smooth a stone, to etch a pattern, to thread beads in a certain sequence, that person was telling the world, this matters. It's a quiet defiance against chaos. A way to say, I see pattern, I see purpose. I shape the world instead of letting it shape me entirely. That's a mindset we still recognize, even if the tools and canvas have changed. And in the end, all of this, the footpaths worn into earth, the cave walls covered in pigment, the tools buried with care, becomes a kind of language, one we're only beginning to relearn. We don't need to know every word they spoke to feel their presence. We feel it in the echo of ritual, in the geometry of their tools, in the stillness of a cave that has held human breath for 30,000 years. Their language was survival, yes, but it was also belonging. It was love, expressed not in flowers or letters, but in food shared, in burdens carried, in songs hummed as snow fell outside. And in those expressions, they gave the world something permanent, not just artifacts, but connection, something that crossed the boundary of time and arrived, quietly, here. As the Ice Age world thawed further, people began to interact more closely with animals, not just as prey or threats, but as presences, familiar, patterned, responsive. With the shift in climate came new behaviors among the wildlife. Herds changed their ranges. Forest-dwelling animals emerged in larger numbers, and in response, humans adapted their relationship to them. In some cases, people likely began observing not only how to catch animals, but how to live alongside them. Tracks were read, not just for pursuit, but for understanding. When the deer passed through, what they fed on, where they chose to sleep. Over time, these observations weren't only tactical, they became woven into stories, beliefs, perhaps even totems. Certain animals may have become symbols of strength, of speed, of guidance. Not pets, not yet, but more than meat, they were part of the story. Some of the most vivid clues about how early humans perceived animals come from their art. Cave walls painted with animals, bison, lions, horses, bears, aren't simply lists of hunted species. Many of the animals depicted were dangerous or rare. Some may not have been hunted at all, yet they appear again and again in places of apparent ritual. Their bodies are rendered with care, sometimes in motion, sometimes layered over older images, as if building a memory. This repetition suggests reverence, a spiritual presence, or a symbolic one. Maybe they represented forces of nature, or spirits of the hunt, or ancestors returning in animal form. Whatever the truth, it's clear they were more than biological targets. They were fellow beings. The line between human and animal was not as hard as we draw it now. It was porous, fluid, shifting with season, myth, and imagination. And in that imagination, we see the beginnings of something powerful. Storytelling, as transformation, the ability to take the raw material of life, hunger, fear, love, landscape, and turn it into myth. To take the silence of the night and fill it with voices that stretch beyond death. In these stories, a successful hunt might become a tale of divine favor. A strange illness might become a curse broken by ritual. A fire in the sky might be a message from the spirits. We'll never know the exact shape of these tales, but their patterns linger in the places where bones were arranged in circles, in the rhythmic carvings on ivory, in the way a figure is placed beside an animal in art. Story gave people a way to understand suffering, to explain the unknowable, to pass meaning from one fragile generation to the next. In a world where so much was uncontrollable, meaning became a form of control. By the later phases of the Ice Age, people were using more refined materials and working them with astonishing precision. Microliths, tiny, razor-sharp flakes of stone, were set into wooden shafts to create barbed points and composite tools. Some were used for hunting birds and fish, others for more delicate tasks. This technology spread widely, suggesting not only innovation but communication. People were talking across distances, perhaps exchanging tools, stories, even people between groups. Trade routes were not paved roads. They were paths of trust, memory, and shared tradition. A group might know that if they traveled a certain direction at the right time of year, they would find cousins or allies with fresh obsidian, salt, or dried meat. These networks weren't formal. They were human, and like all human systems, they were held together by memory and belief. As these exchanges grew, so did the complexity of identity. People didn't just see themselves as members of a family or a hunting group. They began to carry symbols of their wider belonging. Pendants, beads, marks on tools. Some groups may have shared rituals or dress styles. Others may have spoken variations of the same language. The deeper the web of connection, the greater the chance for resilience. If one group suffered a hard season, others could help. If a disease broke out, news could travel, and care could be shared. This wasn't just social structure, it was survival insurance. And in its quiet, steady way, it laid the foundation for the first villages, the first clans, the first whispers of what would one day become nations, long before walls or written laws existed. Yet even with these growing networks, life remained close to the land. People still listened to the wind, still watched the patterns of birds, still read the cracks in the ice, or the way frost formed on a sleeping mat. No matter how skilled they became, they never lost their humility. They knew the earth could turn cruel, that a warm season could be followed by a killing frost, that every feast was shadowed by the possibility of hunger. And perhaps that's why they held on to each other so tightly, why their fires were kept burning through the darkest nights, why their stories were repeated until every child knew them by heart, because they understood something we often forget, that in a vast and changing world, we are each other's shelter. As the earth continued to warm, the very shape of the land began to change. Sea levels rose, and shorelines shifted. Lands that had once been dry and open, like Doggerland, the now submerged bridge that once connected Britain to mainland Europe, slowly disappeared beneath the waves. It didn't happen overnight, but to the people who lived there, it may have felt like the world was slipping away. Rivers flooded more often, coastal forests drowned, familiar hunting grounds vanished, and with these changes came choices to stay and adapt, or to move. For many, the answer was movement. Bands of people set out once again, following rivers inland, climbing into higher ground, returning to places their ancestors may have abandoned centuries earlier. These migrations were not desperate flights. They were measured, learned responses to shifts in the land, and every step they took carried knowledge of where to find water, where the herds would go, which plants would bloom next. With these changes, food patterns shifted once again. In the lowlands, fish became more important. Shellfish, eels, freshwater mussels, all of them were gathered and processed with care. Middens, or garbage heaps filled with shells and bones, show us that these resources were heavily relied upon in some regions. In upland forests, boar, red deer, and elk became central to the diet. Birds were trapped or netted in marshy areas, and insects or larvae may have been collected seasonally for protein. Nothing was overlooked. Even tree bark could be stripped and boiled to create a starchy broth, or chewed for its resin. This knowledge didn't belong to one person. It was shared, preserved through constant use, passed down like a recipe refined by memory. In these moments, survival depended on cooperation, not just among individuals, but between generations. One of the more subtle changes we begin to see is how Ice Age people marked life's transitions, the liminal moments when everything changes: birth, adulthood, death. Some archaeologists believe certain tools or ornaments were associated with these transitions. A particular bead given to a young hunter, a carving made to honor a newborn. These objects, though small, were powerful. They weren't just keepsakes. They were reminders of who you were, of who you had become. They linked people not just to each other, but to time itself. Maybe a mother wore the same necklace through 3 births. Maybe a child inherited a carved bone from a grandparent they never met. These objects held presence. They created continuity. And in a world with no written language, they became the vessels of personal history. Small, sacred bridges between memory and meaning. In the spaces where people lived, the presence of fire remained central. Hearths were no longer just a place to cook. They became gathering spaces, anchors in the rhythm of daily life. In some dwellings, several hearths were arranged around a single structure, suggesting multi-family homes or communal longhouses. The fire at the center of these spaces gave more than heat. It gave structure. Meals were prepared there. Tools were mended beside it. Stories were told in its glow. Children likely fell asleep to the sound of hushed conversation and the hiss of burning pine. And in the quiet hours, long after most had gone to sleep, someone stayed awake, tending the flame, keeping the cold and the dark at bay. In that act, there was more than responsibility. There was care. That person, often an elder or a parent, became the night's guardian, holding space for those who dreamed. Even dreams may have carried weight. In many traditional cultures, dreams are seen not just as random thoughts, but as messages from ancestors, from animals, from the earth itself. While we can't know how Ice Age people interpreted their dreams, it's not hard to imagine they gave them meaning. A dream of a lost family member, a dream of an animal never seen before. These would have been shared, maybe even retold at the morning fire. Perhaps someone in the group was known to dream vividly, and their dreams were treated like omens. These beliefs weren't superstition in the modern sense. They were tools, ways of making sense of the unpredictable. When you live by the rhythms of nature, you pay attention to every sign, the clouds, the cracks in the ground, the shape of smoke, and yes, even the stories that rise when the eyes are closed. In those stories, perhaps, people glimpsed what lay ahead or what still lived behind them. And as they moved forward into this warming, shifting world, early humans didn't leave the Ice Age behind like a chapter ending. They carried it with them, in their stories, in their customs, in their ways of walking through the land. The snow may have melted, but the memory of it remained. The instincts shaped by centuries of cold still guided their hands. And when they taught their children to strike flint, to follow tracks, to sleep with their feet toward the fire, they were passing down more than skills. They were passing down a legacy of survival, of wonder, of adaptation, a memory not written in books, but burned into the bones of the earth and into the hearts of those who knew how to listen. As life stabilized in the post-glacial world, some groups began to stay even longer in places rich in resources, not fully settled yet, but returning to the same lakesides, valleys, or forest clearings over and over, year after year. These places became more than useful. They became familiar. Generations were born and buried in the same soft soil, under the same trees, by the same bends in the river. People knew the land like they knew the lines of a loved one's face. Every rise in the ground, every clearing, every hidden pool had meaning. Some places may have become sacred, not through temples or monuments, but simply through memory. A favorite hunting ground, a place where the sun first touched the earth each spring, a clearing where someone once fell in love. These memories weren't written down. They were walked, sung, pointed out, carried in silence and in story. With these deeper roots came more complex relationships between groups. Where before survival required constant movement and short-term alliances, now people could build longer ties, not just for trade or protection, but for kinship. Some researchers believe that ceremonial gatherings became more common during this period. These weren't just feasts. They were social glue, shared meals, gift exchanges, dances around the fire. These were opportunities to renew bonds, arrange marriages, pass down names, or resolve disputes. It was community maintenance. And though we often think of early humans as isolated bands, the evidence shows otherwise. They knew one another. They visited. They remembered faces and names across the years. And in these moments of gathering, when food and song were shared, they didn't just celebrate survival. They affirmed their place in something larger than themselves. The rhythm of life began to feel less frantic, more patterned. Children grew up with the same seasonal markers each year. The return of birds, the first cracking of river ice, the blooming of familiar plants. These cycles became reference points, stories in themselves. A grandmother might point to the sky and say, "When that star rises, the salmon come." A father might say, "When the tree shadows grow short, it's time to gather." These weren't metaphors. They were calendars. Accurate, embodied, lived through repetition. In the absence of written language, time was marked through experience, passed down through eyes and fingertips, not through clocks. The land told time, and those who listened never lost their way. Meanwhile, artistry continued to evolve. We find increasingly sophisticated items, bone combs with tiny etched patterns, tools with handles shaped to fit the hand perfectly, pendants polished smooth by years of wear. These weren't luxury items. They were everyday objects made well, with care, with attention. That tells us something profound. Early humans didn't just value function. They valued form. A scraper used to prepare hides could still carry decoration. A sewing needle could still be beautiful. That blending of beauty and purpose is deeply human, and it shows us that even while surviving, people sought grace. They found time to add texture to life, to make things that were not only useful, but meaningful to touch, to carry, to pass on. And in the sacred spaces, caves, river bends, stones worn smooth by countless hands, the symbols endured, spirals, zigzags, handprints. Some of them appear in places too remote to be casual. Far inside dark caves, past narrow passages, they're found, sometimes alone, sometimes clustered, always deliberate. These markings may have represented maps, rituals, visions, or something we can't name at all. But the fact they were made in such hard-to-reach places suggests importance. Someone chose to go there, in darkness, in silence, carrying fire and pigment, to press their hand to stone, not for decoration, for something more. Maybe to mark a prayer, a promise, a story no words could hold. And though we can't translate the symbols, we understand the impulse. We still leave our names in wet concrete, carve initials into trees, light candles in places of memory. We still reach for the unseen. Even as people learn to thrive in new ways, with better tools, steadier food, stronger bonds, they remain tethered to their origins. The memories of cold, of hunger, of the great animals that once filled the plains didn't disappear. They were preserved in story, in art, in the way people watched the sky. Elders who had seen the old ways passed them down to children who would live in new ones. And that thread, that living memory, kept them grounded. It reminded them that no matter how the world changed, their strength came not just from invention, but from remembering. from knowing what had been endured, from walking forward with the wisdom of those who had walked before. The warmth that followed the Ice Age brought with it not just new life, but new decisions. The lands opened up, green and fertile, filled with possibilities and unknowns. And with those possibilities came questions that early humans had never needed to answer before. Would it be better to stay or move? Should a group return to an ancestral hunting ground that had changed? Could people remain in one place long enough to plant seeds and harvest them later? The slow move from foraging to cultivation didn't happen all at once, and it didn't happen everywhere. But for some groups, the idea of growing food, of coaxing life from the soil, became more than an experiment. It became a way of life. This change wasn't just practical, it was philosophical. Instead of only following the land, people began to shape it. That shift in mindset echoed through every part of their world. Even before full agriculture, humans had been influencing the land in subtle ways, burning certain areas to encourage regrowth, replanting useful plants near camps, scattering seeds by accident or intention. These were the first whispers of domestication, not just of plants, but of place. Some groups began returning so consistently to the same locations that the landscape itself responded. Over time, berries grew thicker where seeds had dropped. Grazing animals came to expect salt licks or ash-rich soil from fire pits. Human presence began to shape animal behavior as well. Deer trails curved around old campsites. Fish gathered near weirs built from stone. These changes were gradual, barely noticed at first, but in hindsight, they marked the beginning of something profound, the understanding that humans could create predictability. And in a world once ruled by ice and scarcity, predictability was revolutionary. With more reliable food sources came more time, not just for tasks, but for thinking. People could experiment. They could observe which seeds sprouted faster, which tools lasted longer, which fibers held strongest in rope. Innovation didn't come from chaos. It came from space, from moments of stillness, from the pause between struggle and survival. And in that space, people looked further inward. Artistic expression grew. So did ritual. Burial practices became more complex. We see graves lined with stone, decorated with red ochre, filled with beads, carvings, and other symbols. Some included offerings of food or tools, gestures not of loss, but of continuity. These acts told a larger story, that life didn't simply end, that something, memory, spirit, presence, carried on, whether they believed in spirits or simply in the power of remembrance. The care with which they honored their dead speaks to something universal, the human refusal to forget. That same care appeared in how they treated the world around them. Evidence shows that even as people began shaping the land more intentionally, they still practiced restraint. They hunted selectively, took only what they needed, and often left parts of the landscape untouched. In some areas, particular animals or groves of trees were treated with reverence, perhaps considered sacred or protected by custom. These weren't primitive conservation rules. They were part of a worldview that didn't see nature as separate from the self. To harm the land was to harm the group, and so they paid attention. They noticed when game grew scarce. They remembered where trees had been over-harvested. They acted not just out of strategy, but out of wisdom, a quiet living knowledge born from generations of attention. As populations grew, people had to learn not only how to live with nature, but with each other. Conflict was inevitable over resources, territory, or past wounds, but so was cooperation. Archaeological sites from this time show evidence of shared storage areas, communal hearths, and regional gathering points where multiple groups came together. These weren't cities, but they were something new, shared spaces designed to hold many people at once. In these spaces, people didn't just trade goods, they traded ideas, marriages, songs, and maybe even laws. Unspoken agreements about what was fair, what was sacred, what was not to be done. These agreements weren't carved into stone, they were spoken, remembered, passed down like family stories. And in that, we see the early roots of culture, not just how to survive, but how to live together. In all of this, the planting, the patience, the passing down of knowledge, rested on a single truth. Trust. Trust in each other. Trust in the seasons. Trust that the seeds buried in the soil would return as grain, that the hunters would come back from the forest, that the child sleeping by the fire would wake to a gentler world. That kind of trust doesn't appear in the bones we dig up, but it lives in every mark carved into a tool, every careful burial, every hearth that burned long after the cooking was done. These people weren't waiting for the future. They were building it, quietly, steadily, with hands shaped by ice and hearts held together by fire. One of the most beautiful things about this period, the tail end of the Ice Age and the beginning of what would come next, is the feeling of momentum. Not the fast rush of history as we often picture it, but something slower, deeper, like a tide coming in. These people didn't wake up one day and decide to invent society. They didn't set out to domesticate wheat or build villages. But over time, step by step, they made small choices that added up. Choices to stay a little longer in one place, to share meat with a neighboring group, to bury a loved one in the same spot where others had rested before, to carve a tool a little finer, not because it had to be, but because it felt good in the hand. These were quiet revolutions, changes born not of ambition, but of attention. The way they shaped stone tells us a lot. Long gone were the simple flint flakes of earlier ages. In their place, we find microliths, tiny geometric blades, so precise they could be fit together like puzzle pieces into a wooden shaft, to create spears, knives, even barbed points for fishing. The craftsmanship here was astonishing. Each piece had to be struck at just the right angle, with just the right amount of force, using tools made from bone or antler. And yet they didn't just make one, they made hundreds. They taught others how to make them. The knowledge spread across regions, adapting slightly in form, but staying recognizable. That consistency speaks not only to shared technique, but to shared values. A good tool wasn't just sharp, it was balanced, elegant, enduring. It had to last. And so did the knowledge behind it. In these later periods, we also begin to see signs of artistic storytelling taking new forms. Not only were animals and human figures carved and painted, but entire scenes began to emerge, groupings of figures that suggest narrative, a hunt, a ritual, a chase, a dance. These weren't just marks on stone, they were memory, frozen in pigment. Someone stood in front of a cave wall, torchlight flickering, and painted what they remembered, or perhaps what they hoped would happen. Maybe it was a vision. Maybe it was a way to pass on a lesson. This is how we do it. This is how we survive. And around that image, others gathered. They watched, they listened, they remembered, just as you're doing now. And in that quiet circle of attention, something powerful happened. Not just the preservation of memory, but the making of meaning. With every generation, humans grew more confident in their ability to shape their world. Fire was no longer a miracle, it was a companion. Tools were no longer rare, they were reliable. Animals weren't just followed, they were understood. That shift in relationship changed how people moved through space. Campsites became more structured. Stones were arranged in circles, not just for function, but for form. Some shelters began to show insulation techniques, layers of turf, overlapping hides, reinforced walls. This wasn't scrambling for safety. This was design. And with design came the idea of comfort, not as luxury, but as intention. To make a space warmer, quieter, easier to live in, to make a bowl that fits the hand, a bed of grass tucked against a wall. These were acts of care, not only for oneself, but for each other. Perhaps most telling is what they did for the next generation. The children of this time were no longer born into emergency. They were born into memory, into a world that carried knowledge, rituals, and songs. Their toys were miniature tools. Their lullabies were stories of the hunt, the river, the stars. They learned to walk by walking old paths, to speak by repeating old names, to feel secure by seeing the same fire lit again and again. In this way, childhood itself became more than preparation. It became sacred, something to protect, something to invest in. Some burial sites from this time show children laid to rest with the same care as elders, beads sewn into their clothes, food placed beside them, carvings nestled in their arms. These weren't tokens of grief alone. They were statements of love, of hope, of belief that this small life had already mattered deeply. And still, they watched the sky. The same sky we watch now, though clearer then, unspoiled by artificial light. They saw the constellations shift across the seasons, rising and falling like familiar spirits. The moon's phases became a rhythm for planting, for travel, for dreaming. And perhaps they believed, as many cultures did later, that the sky held messages, that the flicker of stars mirrored the flicker of fire, that ancestors lived in the dark places between constellations, guiding silently. We'll never know for sure, but what's certain is this: they looked up, they paused, they wondered, and in that pause, in that silent reaching towards something greater than themselves, they became more than survivors. They became storytellers of the cosmos. As the last shadows of the Ice Age began to fade from the land, they did not fade from the mind. The cold had shaped more than bones and tools. It had shaped the very rhythm of life. Even in warmth, people remembered the cold. They prepared, not because they feared it would return, but because their culture had been built on readiness, stockpiling food, reinforcing shelters, watching the weather. These habits continued. They were no longer responses to crisis. They were wisdom. They were how one honored the past while facing the future. And in this way, the memory of the Ice Age became a kind of teacher, a silent ancestor whose lessons remained etched into daily life. In the archaeological record, we begin to see more layering in settlements, not just a hearth or two, but evidence of return, of rebuilding, of communities slowly taking root. Hearths are rebuilt in the same location year after year. Post holes from shelters are replaced or reinforced. Middens, ancient waste heaps, grow larger, richer, more complex. And with that comes evidence of food that took time to prepare. Ground grains, boiled roots, roasted nuts. This was a patience that only came with security. The world was changing, and people were changing with it. But they weren't racing forward. They were walking, slowly, intentionally, carrying everything they'd learned with them. More elaborate objects begin to appear in these communities. Not just beads or flutes, but woven textiles, intricate carvings, and signs of early ceramic work. Small clay figures, fired in simple hearths, hint at new forms of expression. Some may have been fertility symbols. Others may have told stories, invoked spirits, or honored ancestors. These were no longer just survival tools. They were expressions of belief, of beauty, of imagination. They represent a turning point when the human mind, once consumed by the need to stay alive, found space to create for the sake of creation, and that shift changed everything. Art was no longer confined to caves or rituals. It entered the home. It lived in daily life. These changes didn't happen everywhere, or all at once. Some groups remained nomadic for centuries more, moving with herds and seasons, clinging to old traditions. Others began experimenting with cultivation, with animal management, with building semi-permanent dwellings. This period of overlap, where the Ice Age world met the world that would come next, is one of the most fascinating in our shared history. It wasn't about one way replacing another. It was about weaving old ways into new ones. A people who once painted mammoths on cave walls now watched their children grind seeds between stones. A hunter who once chased elk across frozen plains now helped dig post holes for a winter shelter lined with bark and woven mats. The old knowledge was not discarded. It evolved. And in all these changes, one thing never wavered: the need for each other. Whether gathered in small bands by a river or huddled in new longhouses under the trees, humans remained social beings. Fires still burned at the center of the home. Songs still rose into the dusk. Elders still told stories, while children traced shapes in the dirt. It was the same life, reshaped, the same warmth in a different season. And through it all, They held fast to the invisible threads that bound them. Shared work, shared food, shared time. These were the roots of everything to come. Not the great monuments of later civilizations, but the quiet, everyday acts that kept people close. Perhaps that's the greatest legacy of these ancient people. They endured. They changed. But they did not forget. They passed their world forward. Not only through tools or shelters or painted walls, but through presence. Through the way they stayed close when the wind rose. Through the way they looked at the stars and saw something familiar. Through the way they sang, carved, hunted, healed. In every one of those gestures, they whispered to the future, not in words, but in ways that still live in us. You can hear it now, in the silence between thoughts, in the breath before sleep, in the ancient stillness behind every story. They are still here, not as shadows, but as echoes, quiet, steady, human, as the world softened in warmth, and the vast glaciers that once defined continents melted into rivers and seas. The world of Ice Age humans began to dissolve, not vanish, but transform. Where there had once been silence, new sounds filled the air, the chirp of unfamiliar birds, the rustle of leafy trees, the creak of thawed soil shifting. Forests expanded into plains, wetlands swallowed lowlands, the animals changed too. The great mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and cave lions gradually disappeared, whether through climate change, overhunting, or slow ecological collapse. And with them, the hunters who had followed them across ice and tundra now faced a new reality. But rather than mourn what was lost, they adapted. They turned their attention to smaller game, to foraging, to rivers, to seeds. In every shift, they found a way forward, not by abandoning the old world, but by weaving it into the fabric of a new one. There is no sharp line where prehistory ends, no moment when a person stood up, looked around, and declared that the Ice Age was over. These were changes that lived in the body, before they were seen with the eye. A child raised beside a river didn't know that her world had once been frozen tundra. She knew the rhythm of birdsong and the gentle buzz of insects in summer. And yet, the stories her elders told still held echoes of the cold, of great hunts in wide white spaces, of animals whose tracks she would never see, of snow that never melted. These stories were not warnings, they were gifts, reminders that life had once been harder, wilder, colder, and that people had endured it. The past became not just memory, but identity. It was worn like a coat, carried like a tool, whispered into every fire. And so the knowledge passed on, not through books or scripts, but through gesture, repetition, ritual. A young person learning to knap stone didn't begin by being taught. They began by watching, by listening to the rhythm of flint cracking beneath skilled hands, by feeling the shape of a tool before understanding its purpose. Teaching, in that time, was not explanation, it was immersion. You lived beside the knowledge until it became yours. That kind of transmission cannot be rushed. It doesn't leave behind textbooks or monuments, but it leaves something stronger, living memory. The kind of knowing that settles into the bones and carries forward even when the world around you changes entirely. By this time, the first signs of what we might call villages had begun to appear. Clusters of dwellings near fertile valleys, protected from wind, with space for storage and gathering. Hearths were no longer just places of warmth, but of identity. They marked where a family had lived, where a child had been born, where a story had been told 100 times. The dwellings themselves were practical, built from wood, bone, hide, or mud, but around them were hints of something more. Carved poles, decorated tools, beads buried intentionally in soil. These weren't decorations for the sake of beauty alone. They were statements. This is ours. We belong here. We are not just passing through. The Ice Age had taught humans how to move, how to endure. But now, slowly, they were learning how to stay. And even as they stayed, they carried with them the most important lesson of all, that the world could change and change again and still be met with strength. That hardship was not a reason to break, but a reason to hold tighter to each other. That memory was not just about the past, but a way of shaping the future. Every new child born into this changing world inherited not just tools, but stories. Not just food, but rituals. Not just shelter, but belonging. These were people who had walked across continents, hunted giants, slept beneath stars while the earth cracked with cold. They had survived fire and flood, grief and wonder, extinction and discovery, and they had come out not as broken remnants, but as builders of what comes next. In every person today, there is something ancient. In our routines, our instincts, our gestures of care, in the way we light a fire, cradle a child, gather in a circle, tell a story. These are not modern inventions. They are echoes. They are the lingering warmth of a fire that has never gone out. And as we prepare to close this journey, it's worth remembering, those cavemen were not simply the past. They were the beginning, and they still live in us, in the way we remember, in the way we adapt, and in the way we keep walking forward. Even now, thousands of years later, we carry their story forward in ways we don't always realize. Every time we look out at a wide horizon and feel something stir, that is them. Every time we build a fire, or share food in silence, or sit beneath the stars and wonder what came before us, that is them. They are not distant figures trapped in ice or time. They are our relatives, our reflections, our original teachers. We do not need to live in caves or walk barefoot across frozen grass to know them. We only need to listen closely, to live with intention, to carry one another through the storms. That was their gift to us. Not their tools or their bones or even their art, but their endurance, their care, their wisdom. They remind us that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it looks like staying when it would be easier to run, like lighting a fire when the wind howls, like whispering a story into the darkness just to keep fear away. That was how they survived. Not through dominance, but through devotion, through watching, remembering, adapting, through holding on, even when everything seemed uncertain. That lesson still speaks to us now, maybe more than ever. In a world that changes faster than we can process, there is something deeply grounding in remembering how long humans have been adapting, how long we've been together. We've come so far since those days, and yet the fundamentals haven't changed. We still need warmth, still need shelter, still need one another. Our fires may be electric, our tools made from metal and glass, our words written in code, but the longing behind them, the impulse to gather, to endure, to build something that lasts, that has never left us. The ice age may have ended, but the thread continues. You are part of that thread, listening now, resting now, remembering with me. You are helping to carry it forward, and if you've stayed with me through this entire journey, I want to thank you, not just for your time, but for your presence. There is something powerful about sharing stories like this, especially in the quiet hours. I hope this has given you something to think about, or maybe nothing to think about at all, which is sometimes even better. Maybe you're already asleep. Maybe you're drifting, floating between thought and dream. That's okay. That's what this was meant for. Not just learning, but resting, reconnecting, letting go of the tension that builds in modern life, and finding something older, slower, softer. Before we part ways for tonight, if you enjoyed this journey, I'd love it if you left a comment. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It helps me feel connected to you, and it helps more people find these videos. If you haven't already, subscribing would mean a lot. Not for numbers, but because it tells me this space matters to you too. I've got many more stories to share, and I'd love for you to be here for the next one. Every time you come back, it helps this space grow, not just as a channel, but as a quiet community of people who still believe in wonder. So until then, breathe deep, rest easy. The fire's still warm, and the ancestors are close. You're not alone. You never were.